feminist movement? Well, let's take a look at Canada's political landscape in 1867, portrait of the Fathers of Confederation. Do you see anybody missing? This extraordinary painting hangs in the center block of our Parliament Hill buildings, and it's beneath this portrait that most new members of Parliament are sworn in. And for me, the experience of being a guest for so many of the young women I have been mentoring and coaching who have arrived in Parliament, and to watch their remarkable diversity of ethnicity and race and faith affiliation and sexual orientation being sworn in beneath this portrait is particularly contrasting. So we began with this landscape, but let's give credit in our time together today on two watershed moments. These five feisty Albertan women, the famous five Albertan women, I had the audacity to think that women in our country should be recognized as persons. And so they decided to contest this all the way to Canada's Supreme Court. It was unanimously rejected by Canada's Supreme Court. And so they considered the next step would be taking the case to the Privy Council in the United Kingdom, which overturned our own Supreme Court. And on my mother's birthday, actually, when she turned 10 years old, on the 18th of October in 1929, women became recognized as persons within the Constitution and could be appointed to the Senate. By the way, if you're ever in a city where there is a replica of these five women's statues, you'll notice on the screen to the left an empty chair. Well, do take a seat, or take your granddaughter or your daughter and have a seat and join the women for a cup of tea and just feel the energy of the power of these women's courage in taking forth the person's case that is known. The second watershed was some 30 years later, when we didn't take to the courts, but women took to the streets. And we have to credit these audacious and brave women who were in the streets marching for us to win the right to vote. And federally, it took until 1960 until there was universal access by all women in our nation at the federal level to cast a vote federally. So I like to draw our attention to these watershed moments, and then to zoom forward to this event, which is called Daughters of the Vote. It's an event hosted by a non-governmental organization, Equal Voice, in which every MP in our nation invites one young woman or gender diverse individual to assume their seat in the House of Parliament for a day, and to meet, as you see on the right of your screen, leaders such as our Prime Minister, leaders of the various parties, and in this case, Kim Campbell. It's a moment of great interest that in this particular first time that they held the Daughters of the Vote, there were more women sitting in front of you on the screen right now in the seats of the House of Commons than have ever served up to now in the course of our Confederation. We have a way to go. You'll see at the bottom of the screen that we rank 54th by the Interparliamentary Union, which ranks nations globally on how well we elect women to represent us. And in fact, we are barely 30%, 29.9. 100 women now occupy of the 338 seats. It's interesting to me that Canada has only ever had 13 first ministers, a first minister being either a prime minister or a premier. And in this case, it took until 1993 when on the left, Kim Campbell became the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, our first female prime minister, and buried in her portrait, hanging as the sole woman in the long portrait hall of prime ministers of our nation, are 5 secrets within her portrait. And maybe we'll have time in the Q&A to reveal some of the secrets she chose to intentionally have painted into this portrait in 1993. To the right on your screen are the 12 premiers of provinces or territories. Interestingly, in the year 2013, 6 of these women served simultaneously, and some 86, 87% of Canadians lived within provinces or territories that were led by women. A high water mark, 2013. But 6 years later, there were none. This is the picture of Canada's premiers in the summer of 2019. And in the same year, these were the political party leaders. So of the 6 political parties nationally for which we voted, only one was led by a woman, Elizabeth May. This picture has altered slightly. More recently, Carolyn Cochrane is now Premier of the Northwest Territories, so there will be one woman in the top row now. And Elizabeth May has stepped down, and Anna Marie has taken her place as the leader of the Green Party. But the lesson learned is that ground gained can be lost. So it is very important, as you well know in your club, to be vigilant and to be courageous and advocates for our leadership in our nation at all levels. What about municipalities? Well, 101 years ago, Constance Hamilton took her seat on the Toronto City Council, making history as the first woman ever to be elected to a municipal office in the province of Ontario in Ward 3. And across our nation today, about a third of all the town and city councils, a third of our female councillors or female or gender diverse individuals, and a fifth are female mayors. Now, why does it matter? Is it really just quota? Is it more than just number? It is. In my advocacy of 3 to 4 decades for women, things happen when you purposefully and intentionally add diversity into the voices at the decision table, better representation of the people whose voice these representatives are carrying, better process, more collaborative and inclusive, and therefore at the top, better policy outcomes, the way we spend our money and the programs that we support. It is consequential. So if that is the case, let's move to theme number 2. What is happening during COVID? And in my analysis over the course of the last year, and this is what I spent 2 years at Harvard Medical School studying, pandemics and public policy, what is happening to girls and women globally during the pandemic? I boil it down to 3 basic questions or 3 basic lessons. We need to count differently, we need to design differently, and we need to lead differently. Because the normal as we knew it before COVID certainly was not sustainable and was not fair and inclusive. So how do we achieve A, B, and C? The fault lines in our policy have shown us that all 3 of these need to be taken into account. Well, what about counting differently? I love this photo of 22-year-old Dr. Marilyn Waring, the goat farmer. She is from New Zealand, and she was elected as the youngest person ever to become a member of parliament in New Zealand, and the first woman finance minister. Now, when Dr. Waring became finance minister, she started asking the question, how are we counting women's work? And including in that could be things like, who's taking account for childcare? Who is paying for remunerating or recognizing homeschooling or the domestic work, the caring economy, the informal or seniors care, or the cost of violence against girls and women, or the cost of homelessness or poverty? Marilyn questioned the way we describe GDP, the gross domestic product. Really? Was a nation counting everybody in when they counted what constituted GDP for a nation? So she began to write books, and you'll recognize, of course, the iconic Gloria Steinem introduces one of Marilyn's books, If Women Counted. Marilyn is considered to be the author, the creator of feminist economics, and she provoked her nation and the globe to think differently about the way we are counting. And her several books that you can look up: Counting for Nothing, Counting Women In, If Women Counted. And on the bottom, I put a link to the National Film Board of Canada actually has done a film in its historic collection of the remarkable global work of this woman in challenging us all to count differently. You can't make policy for people you don't see. You can't make policy for people you're not counting and seeing. Now, if you're counting differently, then it leads to designing things differently. And I love what our YWCA globally and nationally has achieved with these graphics. The first infographic I called the iceberg. It was done by the International YWCA. And for me, it's revealing that most of us, most nations, most census only take account for the tip of the iceberg. They aren't accounting for or counting in much of what is actually happening in economy. Are we counting a forest, or only if we harvest the trees and sell the lumber? Is that when a forest becomes valuable? Or only if we bottle water and sell it, does water have a value? What is the value of our environment, and how are we, as an example? So the iceberg challenges us to design differently. And in the similar manner, Canada's YWCA produced a graphic I love. I call it the shadow pandemic. We know a lot about COVID recordings of the official data on deaths and cases and testing and tracing. But behind those COVID numbers, there's a shadow pandemic happening. And they record in this diagram that there is over 3 times the amount of domestic violence happening in our nation behind closed doors, in isolation, in lockdown, to young girls and women. So when you count differently, you begin to see differently, and the iceberg and the shadow become more apparent. And to the wonderful credit of Canada's YWCA, an historic document was produced, the first ever feminist and intersectional feminist economic recovery plan, which is now being taken into account by our Deputy Prime Minister in her actions to design the post-recovery of COVID and what that might look like in Canada. So I challenge us all to not only count differently, but then think about designing things differently. And finally, leading differently. Really? Who are these women's faces that suddenly we're getting to know them? Not only that, who among us knew Dr. Tam before all of this COVID started, and she became a familiar television face coming into our kitchens and living rooms, as well as many female scientists, one of whom was the head of a research laboratory that discovered one of the COVID vaccines. Women public health officers in different provinces, and women ministers, and now women prime ministers. 2 things happened underneath that intrigued me. On the left, Harvard Business Review published within the first 2-3 months of COVID an article saying, will the pandemic change our view of women's leadership? And they pose that question. Are we going to think about women's leadership differently because of what is being revealed during the pandemic? And on the right, a remarkable friend and colleague over in Liverpool University, her name is Dr. Supriya Garikapati, and she decided in the first 4 months of COVID to study 200 nations, only 20 of which were headed by a female prime minister or president, and to compare, using a very rigorous methodology, the outcomes. What happened to COVID deaths and COVID cases? Was there a significant and statistically verifiable difference in COVID deaths and COVID cases in nations led by women? The outcome was remarkable and exciting. The answer is yes. And there are 3 characteristics that she describes: that women are much more risk adverse, is her first conclusion, much more risk adverse in the domain of health. And secondly, they're very decisive. They lock down their economies at a much quicker timeline than do male-led nations. And thirdly, women communicate with their population in a more collaborative and encouraging, building up that understanding of global public common good. So the outcome of both these studies provokes you to think about leading differently, which takes us to our third theme, the exciting discovery of our 95 trailblazing women. Why does it matter that women are on the ballot? It took me 3 years to research this book. I wanted to inspire women to run, whether that was municipally, provincially, federally, any party line, or First Nation in their band councils, and to equip them to do so and to empower them. And I myself, as was mentioned so well by Pat there, thank you, Pat, ran myself. In the bottom left, right-hand side of your screen, you'll see me delivering my speech at the nomination meeting to a couple of thousand people, hoping to win the Liberal nomination to become the candidate. And on top, that's my son beside me, the top right hand. He is former pro hockey player in Europe and now has 2 daughters in Toronto, where I am now. And to the left is the excitement of being the candidate. But then interviewing these 95, can you spot your favorite? Among them, their age ranges from 23 years old to 93 years old. Yes, there's Hurricane Hazel in the top row. And there is one prime minister, which each woman I interviewed for 1 hour about her on-ramp, her journey, and her spinning out, bottoming out, and reclaiming her sense of purpose and moving on. There are one prime minister, 2 deputy prime ministers, 3 premiers, and 49 firsts, the first transgender woman to run in our nation, the first hijab wearing Muslim woman to run in our nation, and many other firsts, 49 of them. 19 of the women on your screen ran for party leadership, for leadership of their political party. And I also included women who did not win and their lessons in the book. Now, I was accompanied by 6 youth teams, 30 young Canadians across the nation who contacted me. They knew me from SHAD, teaching at university campuses in the summer, science and ethics course. And these, interestingly, half of them were young men, did the transcription of the 1-hour tapes and fell in love with the different women. They kind of adopted the woman's story in the book. And it was a great pleasure to inspire and support their careers and have their support. And on the picture on the right is, I took them to Harvard with me, to the Kennedy School, and had each of them present to the Kennedy School the findings in the transcriptions as we had them at the end of the 1.5 years of research. At the end of the book, the youth team also helped me do 3 things, which you would find interesting. And there's a roadmap on the left. If you know of anyone who's thinking about it, the roadmap is literally a picturesque way to how do I put my toe into the water and actually get started in politics. On the right, there are 3 pages of campaign schools, both virtual and in-person campaign schools, some run by the Labour Council, CLC of Canada, some run by the Assembly of First Nation Women, others run by political parties, others run by the Federation of Municipalities. So I wanted to avail to people reading the book the number and breadth of selection of campaign schools, which you can attend from a half an hour to 3 days to put your toe in the water and become equipped to run. And at the bottom, if you were lucky enough, and I was not, but if you were, I wanted to challenge the women who read this book to say, here, look at these pieces of legislation and help us make consequential differences like the feisty Albertan women and move forward the agenda to be inclusive and sustainable for our future. And by the way, those model pieces of legislation, 2 or 3 pages, were sponsored both by women and men. And Maurice Bélanger, whom some of you may have known, he has died of ALS since, but was a member of parliament. And it was his motion to make a gender neutral national anthem. So it does not take a female or gender diverse individual. All persons can help equip and make a more fair and sustainable future. But I wanted to challenge people to see those pieces of legislation. And now we're going to do a bit of a deep dive to take a look at some of these women. There are 7 top tips. And by the way, I think they will be useful for all of us, not just if you're considering running. And the first tip is know the why in any endeavor that you are undertaking, where you're pouring your energy, your time, and your effort. Understand, why are you doing this? And once you are centered and anchored in your why, then that will carry you through. Jenny Kwan is on page 28, 29. I love her why. She said, it's easy for me to answer that question, Betsy. It's the issue that keeps me awake at night. That's why I'm running. That's what I care about. If it's keeping me awake all night, then what can I do about it? I obviously know a lot about the issue. It's keeping me awake. And her why was centered on a question of immigration, actually. We all know Olivia Chow, and Olivia comment in the book is that if you know your why, then when you, and we all will eventually become defeated in politics, you can carry forward because your why sustains you and is that thread. Now, this Morgane Auger from British Columbia was the first transgender woman in our nation to run. And for her, it was the following quote in the book. People were making decisions about my life that knew nothing about what it was like to live my life. No one at that table could responsibly or credibly be a spokesperson for the issues I knew needed to be. I knew it would be dangerous, and indeed it was. She had many life threats and still does, and her family. It was a tough decision, but she knew her why clearly. And of course, Libby Davies, for Libby, she said, Betsy, this is not a theoretical, oh, why are you running? It for me is urgent. And it's a case of life and death. I deal with young girls and women in the street, and the decisions we are making in legislatures or councils or the House of Commons matter. So I need to be present, because for me, it's a case of life and death. So the first tip for anything that we care to give our energy to, any board, any club, or even if we run for politics, is be clear about why you are doing it. And now the pie. This is a really important one. I'd like you to write down, I'd be very curious to know your answer. If you were the candidate, what percentage of your fate do you think you control? Do you think if you were a stunning candidate, if you worked incredibly hard, and on one of my campaigns, I worked for 2 years assiduously, door to door, every possible meeting, and still I lost. So how much do you really control? 100%, a half, a third, a fourth? I'd love for you to write it down, or at least remember it, because I'd love to know what your club thinks. And here is what happened with a few of the stories, because the women said, just be realistic, understand your power and your influence and the platform that you have. Tina is a professor in Saskatchewan, and she has hockey playing sons. And she was always saying to them at the kitchen table, look, grit it out. Anything you want in life, all you have to do is grit it out and it will be yours. And so Tina eventually went on to become the candidate and gritted it out. And on election night, after her loss, when she was sitting at the kitchen table, her hockey playing son said, so, Mom, what happened to gritting it out? And her story says, Betsy, I had no good answer. It wasn't until later I understood much more clearly that even a sitting member of parliament can control about 15% of what happens in her riding. But that is if she's already sitting, she's already had a well-known name, and she's mailing out literature and on television and radio. But the rest of us who run as candidates is closer to 6 or 7% is within our control. And what's the rest? I'll bet you can guess. Think about it, and I wonder if you're going to pre-guess what I'm about to say. Naturally, the party brand. When you start knocking on doors or phoning people, oh, I've always voted blank. I'm a conservative through and through, or an NDPer from the day I was born. So the party brand carries a lot of what will happen to you if you dedicate your energy to this endeavor. The next, of course, is the party policy. And some people will vote. Their ballot box question, as it's called, will be an actual policy. I refuse to vote for that party because of their policy on whatever that might be. And the third element is the charisma of the leader. I ran with two leaders I admire and respect, Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff. But their charisma, their power to attract the vote, it was different than a Justin Trudeau. So you have to accept that the party brand and the party policy and the leader carry a great deal of weight of what will happen to you. And no better should anyone know than Jennifer Hollett. Jennifer was running for Toronto City Council at the time, and this was just moments after her campaign launched, when she had announced with her team behind her, I have stepped down and resigned from being vice president of Twitter in Canada, a huge job, and I'm now going to run for city council in Toronto. What talent, what power to have on the Toronto City Council. And then as she was giving her speech at the campaign launch, her cell phone kept ping, ping, pinging. And the news was that the Premier Ford had canceled a number of the downtown wards, and her ward had disappeared. She was running in a ward that no longer existed. And she'd just given up her job and launched a campaign. And so you go back to the pizza on your right. What did she control? In the end, she gave up a lot and it evaporated before her eyes. She decided to support another woman in another ward. And she's gone on to different things because she's very clear on her why. And here's another why, and who knows it better than Kim Campbell? And interesting that the book that she wrote, she chose to give the title, It's Time and It's Chance. It's not all about the extraordinary skill or experience you may bring to the electorate in an attempt to persuade them to place you in the legislature. She entitled her book, Time and Chance. Now, the third lesson, doesn't this sound familiar? The dragon of doubt, the imposter syndrome. Haven't we all felt this? The imposter syndrome that, should I really be doing this? Isn't there somebody better than I to be doing that? Did you just ask me to run for parliament? Did you just ask me to be president of the Hamilton Club? I mean, isn't there somebody better? And this was discussed by almost every woman in the book. I wanted to bring your attention to Kelly Reagan's story. By the way, her husband used to be the Speaker of the House of Commons. So they had a household headed by two political parents. And they used to have an expression, who's the pick this morning? The parent in charge. which parent is going to drive or make the lunches? And so when she was asked by nothing less than the Premier of the Nova Scotia to run, her automatic instinct was to say, oh no, me? I mean, here's a list of 5 other women, 5 other people, ask them, because she doubted. And she said, Betsy, in her story in the book, I went to church the next morning and it was from St. Matthew, the parable of the buried talents. And she said, it just struck me very deeply. And I went home and had a family discussion and said, you know what? I'm going to confront the dragon of doubt within me. And I am going to phone my competitors and announce to them, I'm going to be running. And so her story was revealing in that even some of the women who are most apparently superficially powerful and gifted have this dragon of doubt that gnaws away at them. Some of the stories you'll read when we have more time together, but this is Amanda Laughlin was the first Aboriginal woman to be elected to the legislature in Alberta. And I wept when I interviewed her. Her story was so powerful about not even knowing that someone of First Nation heritage could go to university, let alone dream of opening her voice on the floor of the legislature, let alone talk about the suicide attempts of her daughter in order to normalize that in the legislature and to share with other women that it is something that needs to be confronted. And even Even McClellan, our deputy prime minister, said, "You bet, imposter syndrome." I was at board tables where the deputy ministers were almost all male. And of course you say, am I, this is in the literature, the imposter syndrome, Google it, and you'll say, I recognize that. I'm feeling a little bit of an imposter sometimes, the vocabulary or the feeling. And then finally, a very good friend. And months, I guess, before Flora's death, I asked her about what she would give as advice in the book. Flora, if you could give to women the gift of your wisdom in looking at a life in politics, what would that be? And in Flora's characteristically sharp, incisive, and to the point way of speaking, she said, that is easy. Never doubt yourself. 3 words, never doubt yourself. And I conclude the book with Flora's never doubt yourself, because I think it's often our point of departure, despite our talent and our desire and our knowledge of our why and our appreciation of the pie, we still have to confront the dragon of doubt. Now, intersectionality, we're getting used to, most of us, this terminology in not only scholarship, but in reality. And it's the overlap of characteristics that I show that Venn diagram because it's where gender is laminated with your faith affiliation, your sexual orientation, your ethnicity, your race, your class. So when you present as a candidate or as a board member, you have many voices. And in the book are several of these. This young woman she has a TED Talk, Rana Bokhari. It's really quite fascinating. If you Google Rana Bokhari and listen, she talks about her 5 intersectionalities. She won the leadership of the Provincial Liberal Party against all odds. But then when she went on to become defeated in the next election, she did an immediate TED Talk to encourage women who were immigrants and who were Muslim and who were young and who were colored to know that these would be the intersectional challenges. Fareen Khan was the first hijab-wearing Muslim for the NDPs in Toronto to run, and speaks in the book about having to send other people to the door who looked more like who might be behind the door in order to at least get the door open to then herself present her as a candidate. And Kemi Akapo was the first woman of color on the Peterborough City Council. Now, managing the media is the 5th tip. And certainly we know not only now is that the print media and the spoken media, but now also the virtual media attacks that happened to girls and women and in the pandemic. But Sheila Copps from Hamilton, she's your protege, and she discusses in the book just how you have to be able to confront what will happen to you when you assume public office. And Valerie Plante, the woman on the screen now, is the first female mayor in the 375-year history of Montreal. And she tells in the book, I couldn't sleep that night, Betsy, when my communications team told me what our logo was going to be. She was running against a former federal cabinet minister for the mayor of Montreal. And when her team announced, we've got to break through the noise, we have to declare something unusual to get the media's attention to leverage your candidacy. And I don't know if you might have guessed already, but it was the expression, the best man for the job is ... So Valerie said, I don't know how my feminist friends are going to regard this. I've got to get used to it myself. But indeed, the moment they launched that next morning, she was flooded with media. Why are you doing this? And what makes women? And so it gave her she was able to use media, in other words, to affect her campaign. Now, here's a woman, Lenore Zand, who was not only a provincial member in Nova Scotia, but is now a federal member. She played Marilyn Monroe in New York and off-Broadway, Los Angeles, and some scenes were nude. And so when she declared to the party she wished to run, she had to make sure they understood that her career path leading to this was quite a colorful one. And indeed, the moment she declared, the tweets began to appear, and one of them was with her well exposed, and her kids said, "Mom, you have to do something about this on Twitter." And so she had to learn the tool of Twitter, and she countered with, "That was Lenore Zann then, meet the Lenore Zann now. I'm about to become a legislator." So in the book, I wanted to equip and empower women to know how much media can be used as a double-edged sword. Finally, the sixth tip to us all is that, you know what, we're all going to spin out, bottom out, and have to learn to climb out no matter where we are in life and what projects we take on. And the names, of course, you'll recognize Kathleen Wynne. Certainly, her first attempt at politics was a defeat. And of course, her premiership was pulled down as well. So she knows what it's like, as does Kim Campbell. And these other two women experienced it, but the one I want to highlight for us today is Karen McCrimmon. And because why? Karen was a pilot and a front runner in the military, and she flew the Hercules behind her into Afghanistan and relief projects into Africa. This is not a woman unexposed to risk, not knowledgeable about high adrenaline tasks and managing these situations. But when she ran for the federal Liberal leadership against quite a large slate of candidates, including Justin Trudeau, she brought such energy and such insight and passion and clarity to her why and what she wanted to achieve as a leader of the Liberal Party. But the instant on stage when they announced the winner was Justin Trudeau, she describes in the book how it's like the turning off of a light with this little switch, and the lights go out. The lights went out, the media flooded over to the winner, and she was left standing alone in great debt, physically and emotionally wrung out, and psychologically, she describes in the book depression. And by the way, all of the stories, I said to the women, without printing anything, I want you to read the paragraphs because I have wept through many of your stories. They are powerful, including violence and being violated, including stories that are extraordinarily personal. So you tell me whether you want that in this book in order to help equip and empower other women. And Karen said, absolutely. They need to know. I couldn't sleep. I was vomiting. It was at the end of it, was on such a high, at the center of attention, with a huge team powering me across the nation. And within a nanosecond, I was left standing alone, as we all experience at the moment of defeat. And she then described how someone in the military called her up and said, "Recognize it, Karen? You have been on an adrenaline high. Your epinephrine was on the fly, like you were flying. And suddenly you're bottoming out." And so the story about being able to situate yourself, re-anchor yourself, give yourself permission to recover, to bottom out, and then to climb out in the way that gets back to the why and your passion and your purpose. So the parts of the stories in the book that deal with this for me are very telling, including those that never were lucky enough to become nominated. Very few, very few get elected. So most have huge stories to tell and to share. So I'd like to conclude this morning, our time together, by saying their seventh tip to you is to either be her, the candidate yourself, at any age. Look at Hazel McCallion in her 90s. At any age, be the candidate. Face the dragon of doubt, know your why, and believe that you are so credible with the amount of life experience you have to offer to those issues at that decision table. One person expressed it, as you've probably heard often, you're either at the decision table or you're on the menu. Or another feminist said, if there's no seat at the table, then pull up a folding lawn chair and sit down. So be her, or ask her. In your circles and each of you, I did as much research on your club as I could, and I'm just inspired by your membership. Ask someone that you know, someone who wouldn't expect it, to say, have you ever thought about running for city council? Did you ever think about running for the House of Commons? It will shock many people because we're all filled with this doubt and this second thought. Or, of course, support her. Pull out your checkbook. I will never forget the first woman who wrote me a check when I declared to be a candidate. It was, oddly enough, and I have no idea why, $67. Maybe it was the 67th day or her, I don't know. But it was, I held the check as if it was a piece of, I don't know, a treasure. It was remarkable that someone believed in me and supported me. So they conclude the book. I conclude my presentation with the request to either be her or ask her or support her. And in this regard, if you're interested in the book, it's published by a house located in Oakville, and it's run by a woman, Maggie Gold. And Maggie has made the offer to your club. Rubicon Publishing is what it is called. That if you click on this, and Pat and Lee were saying they would make this available to your club on the website somewhere, and you quote that discount code at the checkout, that it would, you're given a discount on the price of the book purchase, and it's free home delivery. And my request is that read it and then pass it along, give it to a neighbor, or pass it to some woman to say, gosh, I mean, it's packed with 95 photos and pictures and stories intended to make it an aspiration for someone that might never have considered this to be within reach. And so it is my absolute delight to now go into conversation with you. I'd be delighted to tell you about the portrait of Kathleen Wynne and the secrets in the Ontario Legislature, gallery portrait, or Kim Campbell's, or any other woman that you may wish to ask questions about. And I want to thank you so much for inviting me to do a little bit about feminism in our nation, a little bit about COVID and counting differently, and designing and leading differently, and concluding with these trailblazing women. So I will now stop sharing screen and turn it back for our, it's now about 10 after 2. I hope for another 10 minutes that some of you may wish to ask questions, and I'd be delighted. Thank you. I think Lee is about to unmute you all, and hands go up.
Louise, can you hear me? If you can, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, I just did.
Okay.
Did it work?
Well, I was waiting for Louise. She was supposed to thank her speaker, and she's muted. And I can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. I only have the power to shut you up. I don't have the power to.
Lee, we'll go ahead with some questions first and then work that out. Okay, so maybe maximum 10 minutes, and that would be great. If someone has a question, yeah. Anyone have a question?
I do. It's Pat. Dr. Betsy, have you given any thought to a role for the Women's Canadian Club of Hamilton? How do you see us participating in the electoral system?
What a wonderful question. I suppose at many, many different levels, but let me take it from the level of just pure identification. Maybe you could brainstorm at a future agenda meeting and say, you know, who among us know women who we think we might be able to persuade to either run for their First Nation council or municipally, provincially, or federally, and then see going around the circle whether you could find 4 or 5 women's names, and then say, well, you know, why don't we just approach her and say our club would be interested? We heard from McGregor on one of the, and that said, ask her. So we're asking, have you ever thought about it? And at the back of the book, there's lots of instruction on how to get them started. So that's one way, is to think about asking women to run. Another way is to, in any campaign that is happening, find where a woman is running, and all kinds of help is needed. When my son was playing hockey in the States, I'd show up at whatever city he was playing and go into the Obama campaign and sit down and just make phone calls. And they're all protected and firewalled. So you get a short list and you make 10 calls using a script to say, we hope you're supporting Margaret. She's a wonderful candidate. And it's something that you can offer to do by the phone. And it gives you experience. It sure helps candidates. Volunteers are golden. So volunteer for any woman running to give her strength. And then, of course, another strategy would be to find a woman that you admire somewhere and write her a check, and just say, here is a check that money can be accepted up to a certain limit, I think 1,500, but any amount matters to any campaign to fill up the coffee cups, and so money donations. And then another is to as a club. I'm going to think about that also, Marilyn. I'm going to get back to you with more ideas, but I think it takes courage to make this additional step. And when they read about 95 different women, I think it gives them some kind of courage to say, goodness gracious, someone looks like me that's inside this book and did it. So I want to thank you for anchoring the speech in what you as a club could effectively do. And others may have a lot more ideas. Thanks for the question, Marilyn.
I think Margaret Winters has a question too for you, Betsy.
I think she's muted. We can't hear you, Margaret, for whatever reason.
I would like to know the secrets behind the two paintings of the two people.
It is so much fun. I was a fellow at the Kennedy School in Cambridge when Kim was teaching there as a professor of practice. And I used to dog sit when she and her husband were off doing different things. So they're big poodle. And I persuaded her once to reveal what secrets are buried inside that portrait, because if you look at the spread, they're all homogeneous. Men choose symbols behind them that are either a bookshelf or a single statue of a powerful man. Okay, the first one are the three robes. When you Google her portrait, you'll see there are three different robes, and one is judicial, representing her career in the law, and also her appointment as the first attorney general in our nation. The second is the robe of teaching at the university. So it is the robe she wears at the university in British Columbia. And the third, it was the First Nation, the Haida First Nation robe. And so the expression behind those three robes is the backbone of a nation is its legislation, education, and First Nation. That's just the robes. Those are buried secrets. But she's also posed like this. So every time I take young girls on tour, we stand in front of her portrait, we turn our shoulder and we bury our ring finger. And I said, Kim, why did you choose? She said, because I didn't want anyone to wonder, is she married or is she not? I'm not disclosing. I don't want any of my credibility to be associated with a big or little or whatever diamond ring. So she chose to have her ring hand in the portrait, but with the ring buried. That's the second secret. Third is the brooch on her chest, and it is KC. And there was a woman, here's another idea for you, Marilyn. There was a woman who was a jewelry designer in the city, and they said, Kim, you need some help. All women are broke. Very few come from the corporate world with big check people who will come in behind their campaigns. And so the woman who designed KC, Kim Campbell, sold the jewelry and raised the first money to help fund her campaign, Margaret. So in honor of those women who supported her way back when, she wore KC to be painted forever into the portrait of the Prime Minister in center block. Should I tell you the last two? I'm going to tell you the fourth one, and I will leave you to guess the fifth one. But everyone is going to understand this. She chose to wear black. Can you guess why?
Slimming.
Chanel. Black is so common. It hides all of our possible particular variations. And it looks elegant. It looks, can be dressed up, dressed down. It's common, it's touchable, it's reachable. So she said, I didn't want something very fancy and outspoken. I just wanted it to be an understatement of black. And the fifth one, I'll let you discover. or ask me when I ever get to Hamilton next, I'd love to come to one of your meetings and meet you personally. Okay, Kathleen Wynne. I was invited to this unveiling of her portrait and loved it because she spoke, and you can probably find this recording online, the unveiling of the portrait of the first female premier in the Ontario legislature. And when she spoke about, in that part of her speech, what were the symbols within the portrait, it is always amazing to me how intentional women are. I'm now hosting, as a sidebar here, something called the Feminist Forum. If any of you are interested, go to www.feministforum.ca. Feminist Forum, forum is singular, feministforum.ca. And it's now, I'm going into the fourth one in another week with the Lieutenant Governor of Prince Edward Island and Labrador. Newfoundland and Labrador Lieutenant Governor, and 12 incredible women speakers, along with Garrick Patty from Liverpool that I spoke about in this presentation, and the New Zealand representative. And every woman who's on that forum does the same thing. They wear something symbolic. And Kathleen Wynne talked about what she was wearing as being symbolic. Women seem to be so intentional, even when we're on these. I'm wearing something from Flora MacDonald that she gave me. So, and something from my mother. It's interesting how we cloak or enfold ourselves with a favorite scarf or a memory of our grandmother. So Kathleen Wynne has a pair of running shoes. Go and look at the portrait, and buried beneath her desk are her pink running shoes. She was a great runner, and she said, of course I'm going to put that into my portrait. And she's leaning on a chair. And she said, you wonder why on earth, when I'm getting painted, I would lean my one arm on the edge of a chair. I injured my ankle running that morning. And so when the portrait person said, stand still, I had to lean on the edge of my chair. She also chose to put a book on the table among several books. You can find the other titles if you Google the portrait and zoom in on it. But one of the books was Parenting for Same-Sex Partners. So it is a very subtle way of indicating her sexual orientation, and that how she achieved that position with that intersectionality in her life. And she was dressed in pink. And you might think, oh my goodness, no, because I love pink, and I'm not going to be saying, oh, that's too stereotypic. Let me dress in black and be serious. Someone in the book also who ran in Montreal said, the moment I ran, people said to me, wear black. You've got to blend in. So she purposefully wore brilliant yellow. She'd said, I wore bright yellow for my campaign. So Kathleen describes the color she chose. And then she said, look carefully and you'll find a scarf has floated to the edge of the chair and is draped over the chair in the portrait. And she said, because I love scarves. They may all come from winners, who knows, but I love scarves. And there is one. And I did not want to say, oh, that's too feminine. I have to blend into the hallway of portraits of serious men who have led the nation, the fathers of No, I am who I am. So Kim chose intentional symbolism, as did Kathleen. But you can hear Kathleen's own words on the recording of that ceremony.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I have a question related to educating me. Dr. Betsy, on your bio with your name, Dr. Betsy McGregor, in brackets, she, her, and hers. Could you help me understand what that means?
You know what? I had to learn myself, and I still imperfectly understand it. But it's and there is a link on my website that takes you to a more complete understanding. It is that back in the days of 1995, when I was in Beijing World Conference for Women, it was more women and men. It was more what do we say, exclusionary, actually. And in the last 30, 40 years, sexual orientation has introduced a lot of variations, and probably in most of our families, we have a gay or a differently sexually oriented person, a niece or a nephew. And so the indication pad of those personal pronouns is indicating that I myself I declare myself to be she, her, and her, or elle is French. So this is the way I am. My sexual orientation is female. But then there are those that are differently described. Maybe people here know those who said, my daughter now wants to be called they and them. And the grammar doesn't fit for those of us who went through. You say, well, how do you start? How is they doing? When you're asking your friend about her daughter, how is they? And it's an awkward pronoun fit, but it's an important question. And they said, Betsy, you have the chance to put that beside your name. And that will drive people to say, could I be more careful? And actually, yesterday, when I was briefing one of the panelists for the Feminist Forum that is coming up next week, she said, Betsy, your title of your panel is Women Leaders. And she said, you know, I think that I would like to ask you to consider calling it Women and Gender Diverse Leaders, not just women leaders, because that excludes me. This was this person speaking to me, and she was saying, I'm excluded from that. When I hear that, I don't feel that you're speaking about me as a leader because I'm not a woman. I'm a transgender person, or I'm a two-spirited person, and the two-spirited, that LGBTQ2S, two-spirited, feel very excluded when you just say women leaders, or the title of my panel is women. So that's a really, thank you so much for asking that, Pat. And if you click or if you Google it, personal pronouns, or you go to my website and click on the, I intentionally put whatever those are called above the she, her, and hers, a little thing that you click on, and it takes you to the to the article that explains what is that all about. And and all of you women are looked up to by a lot of people. I think it would shock your grandchildren or daughters or nieces or sisters if suddenly you put beside your name she, her, L. If that is your sexual orientation. And that means that you're aware that people are declaring differently and need to be respected and included for who they are in our nation.
Great. Well,
Great
thank
question.
you for that. And it just demonstrates how much we have to learn, especially our other 90-year-old on our board. Hi there, Mary. Are you still with us? No.
Alice,
not many boards have two 90-year-old women on their board.
Get
Betsy,
running.
I think that'll be our last question. We really appreciate that. And I'm going to call on our new president, Louise Noel Ambrose. I can see it's black there, but
I'm not. Can you see me?
No.
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Thank you for hearing me. Lately, my laptop fell and I may have damaged the camera.
Oh dear.
So I do apologize, but it's beautiful and wonderful to see you all. Dr. Betsy, you are indeed a marvelous storyteller. I look forward to inviting you to Hamilton when we get back to some sort of normal, to learn more about your many, many wonderful experiences that we can share with the upcoming generations of women and diverse leaders. I was thrilled, I was pleased, and I look forward to sharing the information you shared today. So thank you. I thank you all for being here. The questions were perfect, it was on point. And I love your background because this morning I woke up and I'm thinking, that's where I need to be. But I'm not there, but it's all good. But you helped made my day. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for all that you have done in the past and continue to do it for all.
Louise, thank you. And by the way, I'm a McMaster graduate, BA and MA from
hooray.
So
Wonderful.
I lived on campus. I love it. And by the way, your mayor had a book launch for Women on the Ballot about a year ago. And that wonderful woman from your television channel, what is her name?
Annette Hall?
Yes. Best interview I've ever had. And the Hamilton Spectator also gave a fabulous write-up about the book Women on the Ballot. So I come to, and by the way, my brother donated his kidney to his son, and the operation was in Hamilton at St. Joseph's downtown. So we lived there for the 6 weeks of the transplant. So I love the cathedral there, and I love being back there. So you bet I'll accept, and I'll meet you in the future when we're post-COVID.
Definitely. Keep on
Okay.
smiling.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have
Oh,
a,
it was
have a
great.
safe and happy summer. And we'll see you all in the fall, and we'll be in touch. And again, thank you, Betsy, for coming and gracing us with your talk today.
My pleasure.
Goodbye, everyone, and
Oh,
thank
it
you
was
so
great.
much.
Bye, Pat, bye, Lee. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,